Did you know that an entire empire has been wiped from history? Once, if you picked up a map from the 1500s through the 1800s, you'd find a massive region labeled Tartaria, or Grand Tartary. And this wasn't some tiny kingdom. It was an enormous empire stretching from Eastern Europe all the way across Asia. But then, almost overnight, Grand Tartary vanished without explanation. What became of this once great civilization? Did it fade away on its own? Or is there something far more mysterious behind its disappearance? That's exactly what we'll uncover in today's episode of Digging History. Welcome. Before diving into the theories, let's begin with the most undeniable evidence, the maps themselves. Look at maps produced between the 1500s and 1800s. For centuries, European cartographers consistently marked a vast territory called Tartaria, or Grand Tartary. These weren't fantasy sketches, but serious maps that clearly show the empire dominating enormous portions of Asia. It stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, and from Siberia deep into Central Asia. Some maps even labeled regions as Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, or Russian Tartary. This suggests there wasn't just one Tartary, but multiple territories all tied to the same empire. But here's the real puzzle. How does an empire that massive simply vanish from history? And if you still wonder whether Tartaria was real, the maps don't lie. Cartographers from different European nations, French, Dutch, German, independently drew maps that all placed Tartaria in the same location, with the same size and boundaries. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. Yet, by the 1800s, Tartaria began disappearing from maps. Not gradually, but suddenly, gone. As if someone decided it should be erased. So the question is, who erased it and why? At first, there were hundreds of maps documenting this empire over 3 centuries. Then, nothing. Modern atlases don't mention it at all. Geography textbooks never bring it up. It's as if an entire civilization was torn out of history. And if Tartaria was nothing more than a name for scattered nomadic tribes, why go to such lengths to erase every trace? More importantly, what became of the cities and lands that those maps clearly showed? The answers might be more shocking than you expect. Around the same period when Tartaria began disappearing from maps, something extraordinary was happening across Europe and America. Suddenly, grand buildings started appearing everywhere, and not just ordinary buildings. We're talking about massive structures with ornate stonework and intricate details so advanced they still challenge modern engineers. Government halls, train stations, exhibition centers, and entire city districts all rose in just a few decades during the late 1800s and early 1900s. The big question is, where did that advanced knowledge of engineering and construction come from? But here's the problem. The timeline doesn't make sense. Take the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. The disaster reduced much of the city to rubble. Yet, within only a few years, San Francisco had rebuilt itself with magnificent architecture that still amazes engineers today. Anyone who understands the scale of destruction knows recovery should have taken decades, not years. So how was it possible? Did they receive outside help? Perhaps from the Tartarians themselves? And if you think that's incredible, consider Chicago's World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. According to history, this white city spanned over 600 acres and included hundreds of elaborate neoclassical buildings, constructed in just 2 years. 2 years. Think about the scale of craftsmanship that would normally take decades. The official story? These structures were supposedly temporary, built with plaster and a mix called staff. But look at the photographs. Do they appear like flimsy, short-lived buildings to you? Of course not. They resemble stone monuments crafted by master engineers. Yet, shortly after the exposition ended, every single one of those incredible buildings was torn down. The official excuse? They were never meant to last. But really, would anyone spend that much money and effort constructing an entire city of monumental architecture only to demolish it right after? It doesn't add up. This strange decision is what sparked one of the most controversial questions raised by Tartaria researchers. What if those weren't temporary fairground structures at all, but remnants of Tartarian architecture, renovated and then destroyed to erase the evidence? Now let's take a closer look at the architecture itself. These buildings shared strikingly similar design elements, no matter where they stood. The same towering columns, the same grand domes, the same detailed stonework. Whether you look at Chicago, San Francisco, or St. Petersburg in Russia, the style appears almost identical. How can you explain such consistency across different nations, construction teams, and historical contexts? The official story doesn't provide a satisfying answer, unless they weren't designed by separate cultures at all, unless they all came from the same source, the Tartarian Empire. But Tartarian researchers argue the story goes even deeper than just World's Fairs. They suggest the empire didn't simply vanish, it was buried. Walk through almost any city built before 1900, and you'll notice something odd. Entire buildings appear to sink into the ground. What were once first floors are now basements. Windows sit at sidewalk level, peering up from beneath the streets like the eyes of giants buried alive. This phenomenon is what researchers call evidence of the Great Mud Flood. According to the theory, sometime in the 1800s, a catastrophic global event covered entire cities in layers of mud and debris. Hundreds of Tartarian centers were supposedly buried, leaving only the upper floors visible. Skeptical? The theorists point to examples everywhere. Take Seattle. Entire blocks of its historic core are now underground, preserved beneath the modern city. The Seattle Underground isn't just a quirky tourist attraction, they claim. It's proof that the original street level was buried. And it's not just Seattle. New York City's subway construction uncovered intricate architecture deep below modern street level. Similar discoveries appear worldwide: stonework, facades, and entire levels of buildings hidden beneath the earth. Mainstream history dismisses this as urban development, saying streets rise naturally over time as roads are repaved and new layers built over old foundations. But Tartaria, researchers argue, the scale is far too large. We're not talking about a few inches of buildup. We're talking about entire floors swallowed by soil. So the question is, was this slow urban change? Or was it a sudden cataclysm that buried the last evidence of an advanced civilization? And Seattle isn't the only case. Let's go back to San Francisco in 1906. After the massive earthquake devastated the city, workers began clearing rubble and preparing for reconstruction. But what they discovered wasn't just broken debris. It was intact architectural features buried below ground. Facades, archways, and elaborate stonework, as if an entire older layer of the city had been hiding there all along. This discovery lines up almost too neatly with the timeline of Tartaria's disappearance. Just as maps erase the empire from existence, evidence of its architecture seemed to sink beneath the earth. Could it be that the catastrophe revealed what official history wanted us to forget? Mainstream historians dismiss this, of course. They argue the explanation is simple. Over time, street levels naturally rise. Roads are repaved, foundations rebuilt, and ground levels increase as cities grow. They say buried windows and doorways are nothing more than signs of urban development. But Tartarian theorists aren't convinced. Why? Because we're not dealing with a gradual rise of a few feet. In city after city, entire stories, sometimes 10 to 15 feet of buildings, are buried. Doors that should open to the street now open into basements. Windows that once overlooked sidewalks now peer into the dirt. That's not just city planning. That's something else. And then comes the timing. Why do we see this strange, sinking phenomenon in cities all around the globe during the exact same historical period, the 1800s to early 1900s, when Tartaria supposedly vanished? For researchers, this isn't coincidence, it's evidence. Evidence that a worldwide event buried Tartarian architecture under layers of earth, and that official history worked overtime to explain it away as nothing more than construction quirks. Now let's talk about the World's Fairs. On the surface, these grand expositions were meant to showcase progress, innovation, and culture. Cities like Chicago, St. Louis, Paris, and San Francisco built massive fairgrounds filled with towering domes, intricate palaces, and monumental arches. But here's the strange part. These so-called temporary buildings looked nothing like hastily built exhibits. They looked like ancient palaces, colossal stone-like facades, Greco-Roman columns, and structures so ornate that even today, entire cities would struggle to replicate them. And yet, we're told they were made of plaster and wood, built in just a year or two, then torn down immediately after the fair ended. Think about that. Why would anyone invest so much into constructing such magnificent, temporary wonders, only to destroy them right after? Why go through all that effort, only to erase them from existence? Tartarian researchers argue that the answer is simple. They weren't building them. They were rebranding them. The theory suggests that these World's Fair buildings were already there. Remnants of Tartarian architecture, rediscovered after the mud flood events. And instead of acknowledging their true origin, officials staged fairs to present them as man-made spectacles of the modern age. Once the fairs ended, the easiest way to keep the truth hidden was simple: demolish them. Chicago's 1893 World's Fair is the most infamous example. The so-called White City was filled with enormous classical structures. We're told they were made cheaply and burned down soon after. But eyewitnesses described them as solid, monumental, and ancient in style, far too advanced to be temporary plaster creations. To believers, these fairs were not celebrations of progress. They were cover-ups, elaborate events designed to disguise ancient Tartarian cities as modern creations, and then erase them before too many questions could be asked. If Tartaria really existed, then its downfall wasn't just about erasing buildings. It was about erasing knowledge. Many researchers point to the idea that the empire had access to advanced technology far beyond what we're told existed at the time. Take free energy. Nikola Tesla, in the late 1800s, openly experimented with wireless transmission of power. He believed energy could be drawn directly from the Earth and the atmosphere. But what if Tesla wasn't inventing something new? What if he was rediscovering what the Tartarians already knew? Look closely at the old world architecture. Domes, spires, towers with metal tips. Were these just decorative? Or were they part of an energy system, drawing power from the ether, transmitting it wirelessly across cities? And then there are the star forts. These massive geometric fortifications, found all over the world, follow strange mathematical patterns. Some believe they weren't just military defenses, but energy hubs, designed to channel and distribute power. If that's true, it would mean Tartaria was a civilization built not on fossil fuels, but on a natural, limitless energy grid. So what happened?
Once more.
According to the theory, the powers that rose after Tartaria, the same elites who shaped our modern world, moved quickly to suppress this technology. They rewrote history, shifted humanity toward coal, oil, and centralized electricity, and buried any memory of what came before. In this version of events, the industrial age wasn't about discovery. It was about replacement. Replacing free energy with controlled energy. Replacing forgotten wisdom with dependence. And all of it began with the fall of Tartaria. One of the strangest pieces of the Tartaria puzzle is the so-called mud flood. Researchers claim that sometime in the 1800s, a massive cataclysm swept across the world. Cities were buried in layers of mud, buildings sunk halfway underground, and entire populations vanished. Even today, you can find buildings in Europe, Russia, and North America with windows and doors below current street level.
These celestial
Some
bodies,
basements
they
even
follow
look
a
like they were once
predictable
ground
path.
floors. Why would anyone build an ornate entrance underground? The simple answer: they didn't. The ground rose up, swallowing the lower levels in mud. But if millions of people disappeared in this event, what happened to the survivors? Here, the story takes an even darker turn. Not long after the supposed mud flood, a wave of orphan trains began crisscrossing North America and parts of Europe. From the mid-1800s into the early 1900s, thousands upon thousands of children, many with no recorded parents, were relocated across the continent. Mainstream history says these were abandoned or destitute children, sent to new families for labor and survival. But Tartaria researchers ask, what if these weren't ordinary orphans? What if they were the displaced children of a wiped-out civilization? It almost looks like a global reset. Adults gone, children scattered, identities erased. A new society built on top of the ruins of the old one. And the more you dig into it, the more unsettling it becomes. The mud flood theory doesn't just suggest a lost civilization. It suggests an intentional restart of humanity itself. Another strange piece of the Tartaria puzzle is architecture.
This is older than
Across the world,
itself.
we find massive, ornate buildings that mainstream history says were constructed in the 1800s. Palaces, cathedrals, government halls, railway stations, all built in just a few short years, supposedly with horse-drawn carts and hand tools. Take a closer look at these structures. Towering columns, intricate stone carvings, domes the size of football fields, perfectly symmetrical layouts. Many of them rival the great monuments of Rome or Greece, yet we're told they were finished in record time by ordinary builders of the 19th century.
Beacon in the dark.
But the strangest clue is how many of these buildings no longer exist. Whole sections of old world architecture were showcased in massive World's Fairs. Temporary cities that appeared almost overnight, filled with monumental palaces and exhibition halls. Then, just a few years later, most were destroyed or torn down. Why spend enormous effort creating such grand cities, only to demolish them almost immediately? Some researchers argue these weren't temporary at all. They were remnants of the Tartarian civilization, repurposed as fairgrounds, then eliminated to hide the evidence. It doesn't stop there. Old maps and photographs show cities with electric lighting, advanced plumbing, and even free energy towers decades before mainstream history says they were invented. In some accounts, visitors described these exhibitions as if they had stumbled into another world. Clean streets, dazzling lights, enormous buildings, unlike anything in their time. If these weren't simply fair pavilions, but actual remnants of an advanced global culture, it changes everything. It suggests humanity once lived in a far more sophisticated world than we've been told, and that much of it was deliberately erased. One of the most mysterious elements tied to the Tartaria theory is energy. Scattered across old photographs are strange towers, antenna-like structures, and star-shaped forts that don't seem designed purely for defense. Many believe these weren't military at all. They were energy systems. Take the star forts. Their massive geometric layouts resemble modern circuit boards more than battlefields. With radiating patterns of moats and walls, they may have been designed to channel natural electromagnetic energy. In fact, some researchers claim these star-shaped structures once formed part of a global power grid. Then, there are the towers. Slender spires, minarets, and domes capped with metallic ornaments. To modern eyes, they look decorative. But what if they weren't? Some theorists suggest they functioned like Tesla coils, pulling energy directly from the atmosphere to power cities. It's worth remembering, Nikola Tesla himself demonstrated wireless power transmission in the late 1800s. But what if he wasn't inventing something new, but rediscovering knowledge from a forgotten civilization? Even the great cathedrals and palaces, with their domes and arches, may not have been just for beauty. Many believe their design resonated with sound frequencies, amplifying energy in ways we no longer understand. If this is true, then our ancestors lived in a world where free, clean energy wasn't a dream. It was reality. And if Tartaria really did harness natural energy on a massive scale, it would explain why so much effort has been made to erase their existence. After all, control over energy has always meant control over people. Another cornerstone of the Tartaria mystery is the so-called mud flood. All across the world, there are buildings with entire floors buried underground. Grand doorways sit half submerged, windows open into basements, and staircases descend straight into the earth. At first glance, it looks like poor city planning. But for believers in the mud flood, it's evidence of a cataclysm that rewrote history. The theory suggests that sometime in the 18th or 19th century, a global flood of mud swept across continents, burying vast parts of cities. Not just one or two towns, but whole regions. And instead of acknowledging this, historians allegedly rewrote the past, pretending these buried levels were always basements. Walk through old districts in Europe, Asia, or America, and you'll find countless examples. Perfectly symmetrical windows below ground level, arched doorways cut off by soil, even huge public buildings with entrances no longer accessible. It looks as though an entire world was drowned in mud, and we're living on top of it. Supporters argue this explains why
After
so many
kingship
structures appear older
descended from
than their
heaven.
supposed construction dates. What if they weren't built new in the 1800s, but simply dug out and reused after the disaster?
Quiet of the night often
That would
brings
mean much of our
clarity,
architectural heritage
a
isn't
canvas
200
for
years old.
thoughts that elude
It could
the
be
day.
thousands. If that's the case, then the mud flood wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a reset, a deliberate wiping of a civilization that came before, leaving us with fragments half buried in plain sight. One of the strangest clues tied to Tartaria comes from old maps. If you look at atlases printed just a few centuries ago, you'll often see a vast landmass labeled Tartary stretching across Siberia, Central Asia, and even into parts of North America. Not a tiny province or forgotten kingdom, an empire bigger than Rome, bigger than China. But here's the mystery. By the late 19th century, that name disappears. Tartary vanishes from maps, as if it never existed. Historians now brush it off as a catch-all term Europeans used for unknown territories. Yet the sheer consistency of those maps makes some wonder. Was this really just a geographic placeholder? Or were they erasing an empire from memory? Then there are the tales of giants. Travelers' journals from the 16th and 17th centuries describe encountering people of unusual height across the steppes. Some accounts speak of skeletons unearthed that didn't match ordinary human proportions. Were these exaggerations, folklore, or fragments of a lost history that connected Tartaria to the giants mentioned in ancient myths? Supporters of the theory argue the two fit together. A powerful empire, home to people larger than life, deliberately erased from our textbooks. And why? Perhaps because their knowledge, their technology, even their very existence didn't fit the version of history we were meant to inherit. If true, then the removal of Tartaria from maps wasn't just cartographic housekeeping. It was historical censorship on a global scale. A way to make sure we never ask the question, who were the Tartarians and why were they erased? Another part of the mystery is technology. Look at the architecture attributed to the 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries, and you'll see something strange. Palaces, cathedrals, and government buildings so massive and intricate that even with today's machinery, recreating them would be a monumental task. Yet we're told these were built with horse-drawn carts and hand tools. Take the so-called World's Fairs of the 1800s. Whole cities of colossal buildings rose up in just a few years, only to be torn down afterward. Temporary, we're told. But many of these structures looked more like ancient marvels than disposable exhibits. Were they really built just for a single fair? Or were they remnants of an older civilization, repurposed and then destroyed to hide their origin? Then comes the idea of free energy. Conspiracy researchers point to spires, domes, and antenna-like structures atop old buildings. To them, these weren't just decoration. They were part of a system, tapping into the atmosphere itself. A kind of wireless energy grid, centuries ahead of its time. Mainstream historians scoff, calling it nonsense, but the pattern is hard to ignore. Again and again, we see structures that don't align with the tools and resources supposedly available. Were these truly the achievements of their era, or fragments of Tartaria's lost technology, absorbed and rebranded by those who rewrote history? If the free energy theory holds any truth, then what we're looking at isn't just lost architecture. It's the remnants of a global system designed to power entire civilizations without coal, oil, or wires. And if such a system existed, you can see why it might have been suppressed. And then, we reach the most controversial part of the Tartaria story, the mud floods. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, there are countless buildings where the first floors, windows, and even doors sit buried below ground level. Mainstream archaeology calls it settling, or changes in street levels over time. But for those who believe in Tartaria, it's the smoking gun. The theory says that a massive cataclysm, or perhaps multiple ones, buried entire cities in mud and sediment. What we now walk on may not be the original streets, but the rooftops of a civilization buried alive. Whole layers of history hidden beneath our feet. And here's where it gets darker. If an advanced culture once spanned the globe,
Kingship
and if it was wiped out by disaster, Who decided what came next? Who chose which parts of their history survived, and which parts were erased? Because when you dig into the 18th and 19th centuries, you see a strange pattern. Fires, floods, wars, and reconstructions happening again and again in major cities. Events that conveniently destroyed libraries, archives, and records. The Chicago Fire, the Great Fires of London, Moscow, and San Francisco. Over and over, history burned, and with it, traces of what came before. Maybe that's the key. The so-called Old World wasn't just forgotten. It was systematically buried, rewritten, and replaced. What remains are the fragments: half-buried buildings, impossible architecture, strange maps, and myths of a lost empire. Whether you see Tartaria as truth, myth, or something in between, one thing is undeniable.
History is written
Our history
by men,
isn't as neat and orderly as the
created
textbooks
by
claim.
gods.
And maybe, just maybe, beneath the mud, in the ruins, and in the shadows of forgotten cities, the story of Tartaria is still waiting to be uncovered.